Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified. We break down those tricky legal concepts for all you future lawyers out there.
And I'm happy to be here.
Today's deep dive is all about how international environmental law has evolved.
Uh-huh.
We'll be focusing on the big conferences and agreements you'll definitely need to know for your studies.
Sounds good.
Think Stockholm, Rio, Kyoto, and Paris. They're like the Mount Rushmore of this field.
Absolutely. And it's not just about memorizing names and dates for these.
Right.
What's really interesting here is how these events show how the world has slowly but surely been realizing that environmental problems don't stop at any country's borders.
Yeah, that's so true.
It's a story about how countries are working together more and more when facing some pretty big challenges for the planet.
Okay, so let's go back in time to 1972.
Okay.
The Stockholm Conference. Was this the first time the world really came together to talk about the environment as like a global thing?
Exactly. Before Stockholm, the environment was usually seen as just a local or a national issue.
Mm.
But Stockholm brought leaders together to recognize that things like pollution and using up resources were everyone's problems and that they needed a coordinated plan to deal with them.
And that's where the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, came from.
Right.
Right. It wasn't just all talk. They created something to keep things going.
Right. UNEP is like a catalyst for international cooperation on all sorts of environmental issues. And one of their early wins was dealing with ozone depletion, which was a huge worry back then.
Right.
This led to the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer in 1985. It set the stage for a major victory in environmental diplomacy, the Montreal Protocol.
Ah, the Montreal Protocol. That's the one that phased out those ozone-depleting substances like CFCs.
Yeah.
It's often seen as a model for these kinds of international agreements.
Yes.
But what made it work? Getting countries to agree on anything is tough, let alone something that affects their industries.
Well, there were several factors that contributed to its success. First, there was a really strong scientific consensus about how dangerous ozone depletion was, which helped to push everyone to take action. Second, the protocol had financial mechanisms to help developing countries switch from CFCs.
Oh, interesting.
And maybe most importantly, it gave flexible solutions. Countries could phase out those substances at their own speed, which made it more politically acceptable.
So it sounds like the recipe for success is strong science, financial support, and flexibility.
Yeah, that's a good starting point, but you have to remember every environmental challenge has its own unique complications.
That's true.
Take the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, for instance, which was adopted in 2000. This one aimed to protect biodiversity from the risks of genetically modified organisms, GMOs.
Okay.
Now, this was a big deal because it recognized a country's right to put its own public health and environmental concerns first, even if it meant restricting trade in GMOs.
It sounds like it could be pretty controversial, especially for countries heavily invested in agricultural biotechnology.
It was and still is. The Cartagena Protocol really highlights the tension that we often see between trade and protecting the environment, and this becomes even more obvious when we talk about climate change.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of trade, what about the Basel Convention? That one tackled hazardous waste, right?
Yes, in 1992, the Basel Convention was put in place to control how hazardous waste moves across borders. It was a huge step forward for environmental justice because it stopped developed countries from exporting their hazardous waste to developing countries.
Huh.
Before this convention, it was common practice to basically dump our waste problems on countries that couldn't really deal with them.
Wow.
Not very fair.
No, not at all. So it seems like in the 80s and 90s, there was this growing realization that environmental problems were interconnected, and so were the solutions.
Absolutely. And this awareness paved the way for addressing what many see as the biggest environmental challenge of our time, climate change.
And to understand how we got here, we need to revisit the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. That was when the world acknowledged that climate change was a global issue needing a global response.
Right, Rio was a pivotal moment. It led to the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, as well as Agenda 21, which is like a roadmap for sustainable development.
Yeah.
But most importantly, it gave birth to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC.
The UNFCCC. That's the framework behind all those international climate talks we hear about all the time. But it took a few more years before that framework actually led to any action. Right now.
True. It wasn't until 1997 that the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. It was the first real attempt to set legally binding targets for developed countries to reduce their emissions.
Kyoto was a big deal, but it definitely had its issues.
Yeah, there were some hurdles. For one, the United States never actually signed on.
Wow.
And some argued that the targets weren't ambitious enough and that big developing countries like China and India weren't included. This raises an important question. How do we balance the need for bold action with the realities of getting countries on board?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then in 2009, we had Copenhagen, which was supposed to be this big moment for a new climate deal.
Copenhagen was a mixed bag. Negotiations were tough, and the agreement that finally emerged from a closed-door meeting with just a handful of leaders didn't have legally binding targets. So many saw it as a failure and a sign that maybe global agreement on climate action was falling apart.
So Copenhagen was a bit of a stumble.
hmm
Did that kill the momentum for international action on climate change?
Not completely. Even with its flaws, Copenhagen showed us that we need a more transparent and inclusive way of negotiating.
Okay.
This then set the stage for the Paris Agreement in 2015, which took a different approach.
All right, so let's talk about Paris. What made this agreement different from the ones that came before?
Well, unlike Kyoto, which imposed these top-down targets, the Paris Agreement was more of a bottom-up approach.
Interesting.
Countries set their own targets for emission reductions called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, and these were based on their own capabilities and circumstances.
So it was more flexible,
Yeah.
but was it actually effective? Did countries commit to doing enough to really limit global warming?
Well, that's a question people are still debating. While the Paris Agreement was a huge step forward, its success really depends on whether countries follow through on their NDCs and if they're willing to increase their goals over time.
So Paris was a move in the right direction,
Yeah.
but there's definitely more work to be done.
For sure. And understanding all the details of these agreements, their pros and cons, is super important for anyone who wants to get a handle on how complex international environmental law really is.
I think we've covered a lot of ground already, and there's still so much more to talk about.
Definitely. But that's a discussion for our next segment. We'll dig deeper into what makes these agreements hard to put into action, and we'll also look at how international cooperation is changing when it comes to dealing with climate change.
Sounds good. We'll be back right after this.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so we're back and ready to really dig into how these international environmental agreements actually work in practice, or sometimes don't.
Yeah, it's one thing to sign a piece of paper. It's another to turn those promises into real action.
Right. It's like having a recipe, but then realizing you're missing ingredients or the right tools.
I like that analogy. Implementing these agreements often means huge changes to energy systems, industrial practices, even how people live their lives. It's a long and complicated process.
I bet. And I imagine it's even harder for developing countries that might not have the same resources or technology as developed nations.
Absolutely. That's why the Paris Agreement, for example, really emphasizes that developed countries need to provide financial and technological support to help developing nations meet their climate goals.
Right. Okay, so we've heard about this pledge from wealthy nations to give $100 billion a year to support climate action in developing countries. But is that really enough? And how do we even know if that money is being used effectively?
Those are the key questions. While $100 billion is a lot of money, some experts think it's still not enough to deal with the scale of the climate crisis, especially in places that are really vulnerable.
I see.
And then there's the issue of transparency and accountability. How do we make sure the money is going to the communities that are most affected by climate change and that it's actually being used for projects that make a real difference?
So it's not just about giving money, it's about making sure it actually helps where it's needed most.
You got it. There's a growing focus on having strong systems for monitoring and evaluating how climate finance is being used and what impact it's having. This is really important for building trust and assuring the money is used well.
Sounds like a giant accounting project.
In a way, it is. On top of the money problems, there's also the challenge of getting so many countries with different goals and interests to agree.
Of course. Getting nearly 200 countries to agree on anything is a diplomatic miracle in itself.
It takes skillful negotiation compromise and a shared understanding that the climate crisis is urgent. But even when everyone agrees, there's always the risk that some countries might backtrack or not follow through on their promises.
So how do we make sure countries are held accountable for what they do or don't do?
Well, the Paris Agreement has ways to track how countries are progressing towards their emission reduction targets. And there's a growing movement toward more transparency, with groups like civil society organizations and the media playing a key role in holding governments accountable.
So it's not just about the legal stuff. It's also about public pressure and a feeling of shared responsibility.
You're right. International environmental law is only as good as the political will behind it. But here's something interesting. We're seeing a change in who's driving climate action.
What do you mean?
Well, for a long time, it was mostly national governments taking the lead. But now we're seeing more involvement from other groups, cities, businesses, NGOs. They're all playing a big role in speeding up the transition to a low-carbon world.
So it's becoming more of a team effort with players of all sizes stepping up.
Exactly. And cities are often on the front lines of climate change impacts. They're dealing with heat waves, floods, rising sea levels, so they have a big reason to take action.
It's like they're seeing the effects right in front of them, so they can't wait for national governments to get their act together.
Exactly. And a lot of cities are actually more nimble and innovative than national governments when it comes to implementing solutions. They're putting money into renewable energy, promoting sustainable transportation, adapting infrastructure to handle climate risks.
Like a global grassroots movement.
You could say that. And businesses are also realizing that climate change brings both risks and opportunities. They're seeing that investing in sustainability can actually be good for their bottom line.
So it's not just about being altruistic anymore, it's about smart business.
Precisely. And then we have the NGOs. They do a vital job raising awareness, advocating for stronger policies, and holding both governments and businesses accountable.
They're the watchdogs keeping everyone honest.
Yes, their work is essential to make sure climate action stays a top priority globally.
So it seems like the fight against climate change is becoming more decentralized with this network of different actors all contributing in their own ways.
That's a sharp observation. And it raises an interesting question. Can this distributed approach to climate action actually be more effective than just relying on top-down agreements?
Now that is a great question. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, I want to hear more about this idea of climate clubs you mentioned earlier.
Yes, climate clubs. They're a pretty new and interesting development in international climate cooperation.
Okay, give me the rundown. What exactly is a climate club?
Picture this. You have a group of countries, the ones who are really serious about taking ambitious climate action. They get together and form a club with its own rules and benefits. These clubs are meant to boost cooperation, speed up emission cuts, and create economic advantages for members.
So it's like a VIP section within the bigger climate action party.
You could put it that way. Climate clubs are a way for countries with shared goals and who are willing to go further than the minimum requirements of global agreements to collaborate more closely and maybe achieve faster progress.
What's interesting here is that it suggests a move towards more focused and maybe even more effective types of cooperation.
Exactly. Climate clubs let like-minded countries bypass some of the headaches and limitations of bigger international negotiations and really focus on concrete actions that produce real results.
It's like a smaller, more agile team within a big organization, able to move faster and try new things.
And one of the most intriguing things about climate clubs is that they could create economic incentives to join.
What kind of incentives are we talking about?
Well, one idea is to have carbon tariffs on goods imported from countries that aren't in the club. This would make it more expensive for non-members and encourage them to join and adopt more ambitious climate policies.
So it's a way to use trade rules to push for climate action.
Precisely. And there are other potential incentives like special trade agreements for low-carbon products or giving access to green technology. The idea is to create a system where being part of the climate club just makes economic sense.
Like a rewards program for being climate friendly? But wouldn't this risk causing divisions or trade wars?
It's a valid concern. Some say climate clubs could make existing trade tensions worse and create an unfair playing field. The challenge is to design these clubs so they're both effective and inclusive and make sure that developing countries aren't left out.
Sounds like walking a tightrope.
It is. But the fact that climate clubs are emerging shows how international climate cooperation is evolving. We're seeing a shift toward more flexible dynamic and potentially more effective ways of working together.
It's clear that fighting climate change doesn't have a one-size-fits-all solution. There are multiple paths, each with their own strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the subtleties of these different approaches. It helps us navigate this complex landscape and find solutions that work for everyone.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the early days of international environmental law to these complex climate clubs and the growing role of non-state actors.
It's been a fascinating journey tracing how international cooperation has evolved and how the world is trying to find solutions to one of the biggest challenges humanity has ever faced.
But I feel like this conversation is far from over.
Absolutely.
But I think we should move on to one of the most debated topics in international environmental law: how climate change and international trade intersect.
Oh, that's sure to be a lively discussion.
Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive, and we've saved a really tricky issue for last: climate change and international trade.
Oh, yeah, it's a topic full of complexities.
Right.
It's like you're trying to solve two puzzles. At the same time, you've got this urgent need to address climate change,
Right.
And then you've got this whole intricate system of global trade rules.
It's like trying to merge two busy highways during rush hour.
Exactly. At the center of all this is the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which basically sets the rules for international trade.
Right.
The WTO's main goal is to promote free trade, get rid of barriers and make sure it's a fair playing field for businesses. But sometimes those goals can clash with trying to protect the environment.
So it's not that the WTO is against the environment. It's just that its priorities are different.
You got it. The WTO is all about making the economy efficient and reducing trade barriers.
Okay.
And sometimes that makes it hard for countries to put environmental policies in place that might affect trade.
I see. Can you give us a real-world example of how this conflict might happen?
Sure, let's say a country wants to stop importing goods that are made in really polluting ways, like steel made using coal power. That could be seen as a trade barrier by the WTO, even if the country is trying to protect the environment.
So a country could be doing the right thing to tackle climate change and still get in trouble with these trade rules.
Exactly. And that's just one example. The relationship between trade and climate change is complicated, and it's caused a lot of arguments at the WTO.
So it's a real problem happening in courtrooms and trade negotiations.
Absolutely. These disputes show just how hard it is to balance free trade with protecting the environment. It takes a lot of thought and creative solutions.
It feels like we're stuck. How do we have a strong global economy and also deal with climate change?
That's the big question. And there's no simple answer. It means navigating competing interests, finding common ground, and coming up with new approaches that work for both the economy and the environment.
So what are some ways forward? What are some possible solutions being considered to bridge this gap?
One idea is to change the WTO rules so they're more friendly to environmental concerns. Some say the WTO should clearly say that countries can take trade measures to protect the environment as long as they're fair and based on good science.
So basically updating the rule book for the 21st century.
Right. Another idea is to encourage trade in things that are good for the environment. This could mean lowering tariffs on things like renewable energy technology, sustainable agriculture products, and other green innovations.
So using trade to help us move to a low-carbon economy faster.
Exactly. By making it easier and cheaper to trade green goods, we can encourage businesses to adopt more sustainable practices and shift those global markets toward a greener future.
Trade as a force for good.
That's the idea.
Wow.
And then there are these voluntary sustainability standards and certifications that are becoming more popular. These standards are often created by NGOs or industry groups, and they set benchmarks for environmentally and socially responsible production.
So it's not just governments setting rules. Businesses are setting their own standards for sustainability.
Exactly. And consumers are starting to demand products that meet these standards, which creates a market incentive for companies to go green.
Consumer power at work.
Right, consumer demand is a powerful thing. And as people become more aware of environmental problems, we'll probably see even more demand for sustainable products and practices.
So it sounds like it's a mix of government rules, pressure from consumers, and creative market solutions, all working together to make the global trade system more sustainable.
That's the goal. It's a multi-pronged approach, and it's definitely still a work in progress. But the good news is that more and more people are recognizing that trade and climate action don't have to be enemies. They can work together for a sustainable and prosperous future.
This seems like an area where there's a lot of potential for innovation and advocacy in law.
Absolutely. Law students have a really important role to play in shaping the legal frameworks that will govern this whole relationship between trade and climate change in the years to come.
So it's not just about understanding the law, it's about shaping the future.
Right. And that's what's so exciting about this field. It's about using legal expertise to address real-world challenges and help create a more just and sustainable world.
Well said. I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into how international environmental law has evolved. It's been a fascinating journey from the early days of the Stockholm Conference to the challenges of making trade and climate action work together.
It really has. We've explored the big wins, the setbacks, and all the efforts being made to create a more sustainable future.
And if there's one thing we've learned, it's that international cooperation is key to dealing with global environmental problems. But it's not always easy. It takes constant adaptation, innovation, and a willingness to try new things.
It does, and it takes engaged and informed citizens who understand the complexities of these issues and are committed to finding solutions.
So to all you future lawyers out there, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep looking for creative solutions to the environmental challenges we're facing.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on LexTalks. Subscribe for more insightful legal discussions. We'll see you next time.